Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto got harem with Annabeth and Reyna? Part 1. Huge shout out to Helghy for this story. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so without wasting any time, let's get into the video. Karama Uzumaki had always been protective of his baby sister. She was only his half-sibling, but still Kushina had been his most cherished family member. He'd sadly missed much of her life, having not only served in the Legion as a son of seers should, but also serving in the Senate for nearly a decade more. He had a small villa in New Rome and was a well-regarded veteran of the Legion and a citizen of New Rome. Sadly, his family had decided against uprooting themselves and had remained in Sacramento rather than moving to New Rome. He didn't hold it against them and he visited them as much as he could. He should have known Kushina would catch the eye of one of the gods. He hadn't really expected it to be his uncle and brother-in-law. He didn't hold it against either of them though. He had met his sister Proserpina once before and the two were alarmingly similar. It seemed Pluto had a type. Sadly, Karama knew that the attention of one of the three kings meant hardship and heartache. The first was of course Pluto saying goodbye. Kushina had been understanding, but as soon as her godly lover was gone, she had been heartbroken and inconsolable. Seeing her in such a way had made Karama come to resent the Lord of the Underworld. Something his mother Seers seemed pleased with. That was the smallest of issues to come though. Pluto had warned Kushina, just as Seers had warned Karama and his father, that the scent of a demigod born of one of the godly kings would attract monsters far more than even a child born of one of the other Olympians. They just hadn't understood how much worse it would be than it was for Karama. Naruto, Karama's adorable nephew, had only been born minutes earlier when Karama's father and stepmother had been killed by a monster in the very hospital that Kushina had just given birth in. Karama had slain it, but it would only be the first of many. Over the next 2 years Karama had been forced to leave the Senate and seal up his house in New Rome. Instead he lived with Kushina and Naruto, protecting them at all times. Sadly, there were things not even a veteran legionary could protect them from. Cancer happened to be one of them. It was mercifully quick, Karama supposed. He knew many victims of the disease who fought it and suffered for a lifetime. Kushina never had much of a chance. So in the end it had been himself taking care of a 2-year-old child in a tiny house in Sacramento. He didn't complain about his task, he was a legionary after all. They did what had to be done. Sadly, even his lifetime of experience couldn't protect the child of Pluto forever. Naruto couldn't do anything but cry and scream as he tried to stop the blood running from his uncle's chest. The man seemed more focused on calming the boy down than the gaping tear across his chest caused by the monster's claws. Karama had slain the creature but at terrible cost. He knew he was dying, even Naruto knew he was dying. He wasn't stupid. "It will be alright," Karama tried to say, only for Naruto to splatter him with tears as the little boy frantically shook his head. He knew what was happening. "Listen to me, Naruto, don't forget this, but remember especially this isn't your fault." Karama began. Naruto was confused but listened intently. He burned the words into his mind, memorizing them forever. Children shouldn't have to fight to survive. It's the job of adults to protect them. That's not the world we live in though, you will have to fight. Fight to protect others. Especially family. Karama said as he rubbed the boy's head. Naruto nodded slowly, memorizing the words, but too focused on his dying uncle to even try to think about the things the man was saying. Karama smiled sadly at the boy before laying his ornate and jeweled sword on the ground. It was an imperial gold spatha he had been awarded during his service with the Legion, and it meant a great deal to him, a perfect sacrifice to his mother though. "Mother, hear me please." He began softly while spreading a small mix of his blood and the earth onto the blade. "Please take my nephew to the wolf house. Take him to Lupa. Watch over him as you watched over me. As if he is your own. I beg you." Karama rasped as he felt his life slipping away. A change in the breeze and faint shimmer of light announced the goddess's arrival. She stood and stared down into the eyes of one of her beloved children and nearly cried as she saw the happiness at her appearance in his eyes. His lips curled into a smile and he weakly motioned toward the boy. Seers turned and was a bit unsettled by how much Naruto looked like a blend of her brother and her son. She wanted to hate the child. Had it not been for him, her own son would have lived a long fulfilling life in New Rome. She couldn't hate him though. "Naruto, this is your grandmother. She is going to take you to become a Roman." Karama gently pushed Naruto towards Seers. She bent down and scooped the toddler up. He slowly relaxed into her arms despite the fact that he continued to cry. Seers paid it no mind. She was a fertility goddess and goddess of motherly relationships. She had reared children before. Her focus was on Karama rather than Naruto though. "My son," she began but paused as she saw he was looking up to her expectantly. Blood ran down his chin and she felt her heart ache at the sight. "You have done me so proud," she said to him, causing the man to smile weakly up at her. He then drew out an envelope from his pocket and held it up to her. This is a written recommendation from me to the Legion. Please give it to them when he joins. I want him to have his pick of placement. Karama pleaded. Sears took the envelope and by the time she had stood once again she realized that he had stopped breathing. The dam finally broke and her own tears began to roll down her cheeks as she stared down at her child's corpse. Sister, I will take him. A familiar voice called from behind her, causing her eyes to narrow and jaw to tighten. Pluto, she hissed. I will carry his body to New Rome and his spirit to the afterlife. He will be cared for, I promise you. Pluto said, and Sears slowly softened her features. The goddess noticed the little boy in her arms was staring at his father, who was staring back. With a thought she sent the child into a light slumber before turning fully to her brother. He clearly was affected by her son's passing as well, and she couldn't help but wonder what it was that drew him to her children. She knew his love for Proserpina was genuine, and right now she could tell he had a great respect for her son as well. Then I will entrust him to you, Pluto. I must take Naruto to Lupa, make sure the Romans know how he died. She instructed her sibling. They will honor him properly or they will answer to me. Pluto responded simply before fading into shadow along with her deceased child. Sears nodded at the empty spots her family members had just held. With that she began to leave herself. Naruto might not have been her actual grandchild, but she had loved his grandfather, and her own son had evidently assigned her the role of grandmother for the boy. She'd do what she could for her new grandchild then. Lupa had been a bit shocked with Naruto's arrival. A child of Pluto in this day and age was surprising enough, one carried by Sears. Now that was the start of a story, the likes of which dated back to antiquity. She was excited to test the boy herself. The mother of Rome had been surprised by how attached or at least protective of the child Sears had been. At least until Sears had told her what had happened to lead to her delivering the boy to the wolf house. Lupa was a bit saddened by the passing of Karama, though she was proud of how he went out. Fighting like a Roman should. He had a bit of bestial nature to him that Lupa had enjoyed during his time with her, so she'd felt a little more attached than the average demigod passing through her home. Sears had left shortly after she arrived, just long enough to say goodbye to her grandson. Lupa assumed the woman would likely be mourning her child for some time. The greenery around the house had wilted faintly due to the goddess's emotions already. At the moment Lupa was inspecting the boy standing before her. A son of Pluto through and through. He smelled of the deep earth and blood, though being as he actually still had his uncle's blood staining his clothes and hands, that might have had nothing to do with his heritage and everything to do with his circumstances. Do you know who I am, child? Lupa asked sharply. Grandma called you Lupa. He replied. Yes, but do you know who I am? She questioned him again. He slowly shook his head. Lupa hummed, though it sounded more like a growl to Naruto. She circled again as she continued to take stock of him. You will learn in time, that is if you pass the test. She said with a sniff that tousled his hair. Run, child, and if you make it to the house before I catch you, you pass the first part. She growled, causing him to step toward the door hesitantly. If you pass all the parts of the test I won't eat you. She barked harshly, sending him scurrying toward the doorway. She waited a few brief seconds before taking off to snap at his heels as he ran. A mere month, that was all the time Naruto had spent with Lupa, and already the old wolf was growing attached to him. It was hard not to, the children of the big three usually had a charisma about them even as little babes that simply drew others to them. Naruto was abnormal in that though. Pluto's spawn were typically the least enthralling of the children of the big three, but Naruto had a way of connecting with herself and the others in her pack, more than could be expected. She might have been wrong, she supposed. It had quickly become clear that Naruto possessed that hint of bestial ferocity his uncle had been known for, that Lupa had recalled. That might have made her biased toward the boy. She doubted that though. They had recently been joined by another demigod bound for New Rome and the Legion. Jason was a son of Jupiter though, and while he clearly possessed the charisma and talent that came with such heritage, Lupa felt the pull toward Naruto. Neither child seemed to realize it yet, but Jason naturally followed his cousin. The wolf mother thought such a thing was humorous considering their father's situation. The time for Naruto to leave for the Legion was fast approaching. She almost felt sad at his upcoming departure. Still she knew he would do her proud in the Legion, just as Jason would when his time came. As if reading her thoughts and deciding to arrive at that moment to clarify just how special the boy was, his father appeared before her. The grim calculating expression of Pluto stared back into her own predatory eyes for a time before the god stepped forward with his hand outstretched. On it was a simple black ring. Pluto slid a finger across the band of metal that Lupa recognized as Stygian iron, and the ring shifted into an equally black and glittering Hispaniensis-style gladius. Lupa, it's time for him to join, correct? Pluto asked coolly. He seemed his usual regal and chilling self. Yes, very soon. She replied, bowing her head slightly in respect to the being before her. Pluto was rigid and followed rules and etiquette more than most of his fellow Olympians, and so expected some similar action from those he had dealings with. Then he will bear this with him at all times. The blade of Scipio Africanus, my own legacy. It will serve him well in Camp Jupiter and during his time with the Legion. Pluto said before brushing his thumb across the pommel, converting the sword back into a ring again. I will give it to him as he leaves. Is there anything else, she asked. At the moment no, though I am curious to know how he and Jupiter's child get along. He said as he handed over the ring. Very well, it is almost humorous as Jason follows Naruto's lead more often than the opposite. They are more like brothers, and Naruto currently seems the more confident of the two. Lupa said proudly. They actually reminded her of Romulus and Remus, though more cooperative with one another. The thought suddenly worried her actually, and she hoped they remained friendly with one another and didn't end up like her first human boys had. Pluto seemed to brighten ever so slightly at what Lupa had said, his lips curling the tiniest of margins. I leave you to it then. Pluto said before abruptly disappearing into shadow. Lupa stared at the place the god had stood a moment ago. Recently Naruto had been showing signs of manipulating shadows as well. He was years from traveling via such things, but he was taking steps in that direction. I had best give the pup his gift now, he will have one more night of rest, then it is time. The wolf mother said to herself thoughtfully before turning and returning to the house. Lupa personally took Naruto to New Rome and Camp Jupiter the day after meeting with Pluto. Typically she gave the demigods that passed through her care a guide from her pack and instructions for reaching the camp. Things were a bit different for Naruto and Jason though. Not because of their parentage, Lupa wasn't foolish enough to discount it fully, but neither boy would receive special treatment based on their parentage. She would give them special treatment for their age though. After all, not even she expected a 3-year-old to fight their way through monster-infested California to the safety of the Legion. The citizens of New Rome and legionaries alike had flocked around to get a peek at Lupa in her humanoid form alongside the small child she had brought. She had sent them scurrying at her instruction to summon the Senate, praetors, and centurions. In the meantime she gave the toddler a tour of his new home. Naruto had immediately been excited at joining the Legion. Which was good as he would likely be a member for longer than any other in living memory, he and Jason both. The young legionaries seemed less enthused about a small child like him joining their ranks, though as they were certain it would be more akin to babysitting than getting a new probatio. Lupa wished she could be there when they realized just how different from a normal child her boys were. Eventually they came back to New Rome and finally to the Senate house. Lupa but back a sigh at the sight before her. So far from the greatness of old Rome. 17 demigods in total stood in the chamber. The 2 praetors each represented Jupiter and Hera, as well as led the meeting, while the 10 senators were individually elected for an Olympian to represent. Their heritage didn't matter as currently a child of Bellona represented Neptune, albeit reluctantly, and legacies of Ceres represented both Minerva and Diana, and a legacy of Bacchus represented Ceres herself. The centurions sat behind and away from the senators, making their presence known, but remaining respectfully out of the way of the others. Lupa put the thoughts of old Rome and comparing it to this shadow to the back of her mind as she stepped into the center of the room with Naruto holding her hand. The wolf goddess nearly grinned as she heard the muted awes from the girls gathered there. Romans? She greeted. Mother Lupa, the room greeted back in unison. You can easily tell why I had you all summoned here so suddenly. Lupa began as the eyes of the room flicked from her to the boy who was taking in the looks of the others in the room without issue. Before Lupa could continue though a bright flash and mild scent of earth and flowers entered the room. Ceres was suddenly standing among them as well, smiling lightly down at the little boy looking back up at her. Slowly his confused face changed as his head twisted to the side like a little pup. Grandma? He asked, causing the group of demigods to blink. Hello, sweetheart. Ceres said as she gently rubbed his head before turning to face the leaders of New Rome. No, I am not the parent of his parent. My son was his uncle however, and my brother is his father. Ceres explained while fishing out the sealed letter from Karama. He is the son of Pluto, she declared, causing the demigods to take in a breath of shock and stare wide-eyed at the boy before them. That is not all. I claim him as my champion, and this is the letter of recommendation and patronage from his uncle Karama Uzumaki. The demigods were dumbstruck by this sudden influx of information. A couple stammered in shock, but before they could say anything the centurions fell into a whispered argument as they fought over who would receive the boy into their cohort. Centurions, be silent. One of the praetors bellowed, silencing the 5 teens immediately. The other praetor had not stopped staring at the boy before she looked up at the 2 goddesses once again. He is awfully young. She said simply. Lupa smirked. She recalled the girl easily. A daughter of Mars, she was no nonsense even years ago when she had been a guest at the Wolf House herself. He is, but that means he will grow up among the Legion. You will do well to guide him, he is a child of one of the divine kings and is meant for greatness. Greatness that will better Rome and the Legion. Lupa stated. Then all that is left is what cohort he will be assigned to. The male praetor, a son of Mercury, said. That shall be his decision. Myself and Lupa have no need to remain beyond one final token that will denote him as my champion in the future. Sira said before waving a hand and summoning a pendant on a necklace. She leaned down and slipped it over Naruto's head, letting it hang down to rest on his chest. Naruto blinked and looked at the pendant now hanging from his neck. The same as the tattoo used by the Legion for her children and legacies. A stalk of wheat crossed with a sickle. Suddenly though, she yanked it from Naruto's neck, causing it to spring into a scutum shield. One marked clearly with sickles and wheat to represent seers. It is too large for you to wield yet, but in time you will bear this shield in the defense of your home and your brothers and sisters of the Legion. She informed Naruto, who nodded at her words. With a twist of the handle she shifted the shield back into its necklace and once again draped it over Naruto's head. With that both she and Lupa disappeared in a flash. After getting over their brief shock, the older demigods welcomed the boy and helped to get him situated before the centurions each began trying to convince the toddler into their force. Near the wolf house both Lupa and Ceres reappeared before turning to look at one another. Lupa grinned fiercely at the Olympian, who simply rolled her eyes. Your champion? That was shocking. Lupa commented. Yes, well I know that Juno did something similar for Jupiter's boy. Besides, Karama did name Naruto as my grandson. Ceres huffed. And the shield. I wasn't surprised by Pluto giving him something, but you as well. I also didn't recognize it from anywhere. Lupa continued. That is because it was crafted just for Naruto. I had it commissioned with Vulcan for when he joined the Legion. I figured it would be like my brothers to make sure their children had a blade or something. So he needs something to protect himself. Ceres defended, making the wolf mother grin. Of course. Lupa simply replied. When Jason joined the Legion, he was met with a similar if far more elaborate welcome than Naruto had received. They had practically rolled out the red carpet for the boy in the first cohort. In the end though, that had been a waste of time. The moment that Jason had seen Naruto was in the 5th, he had made it clear he planned to join the same unit. Needless to say, both boys had quickly become beloved by the 5th, almost like the cohort's mascots. Naruto, having had a month of more experience in the Legion than his cousin, had once again taken the lead between the two of them to show Jason the ropes. The few older members had been noticeably uncomfortable with such a thing, but still Jason seemed to defer to the boy naturally, even when placed in charge. The centurion of the 5th cohort, Charlie Trolla, had decided it was best to keep that news quiet. He knew new Romans could get murderously agitated over the slightest of problems. The idea that Lord Jupiter might take offense to his son not being treated as a leader in comparison to his brother's child wasn't something that most legionaries would be surprised by. The citizens of the city though? As far as Charlie was concerned, they were 1,000 times worse. At the moment Charlie just wanted the two little kids to enjoy a warm welcome to the Legion and not have to worry about anything to do with the politics they would eventually find themselves embroiled in. That being said, it didn't stop him from grinding them into the dirt to train or from branding them with the tattoo of the Legion. After all, training them hard this early on meant that much harder they could train when they were older, and that much harder they could fight when the time came. And it would come, as great as it was to have two children of the Big Three, and Charlie, like much of New Rome, considered them the sons of the good two of the Big Three, it was also an ill omen for the future. After all, the children of Jupiter, Pluto, and the other Olympians always seemed to crop up more when hard times were coming. He just hoped that his cohort and the Legion could prepare the boys for whatever challenges they would face. Alright boys. That's enough. Charlie called, causing Naruto and Jason to separate from where they had been wrestling under the watch of one of the older legionaries. They stood at attention while catching their breath, and Charlie couldn't help the grin on his face. They were just toddlers and already had better attitudes and in some cases skills than most provides he had to deal with. It was kind of a bummer that he would be retired from Legion life by the time they were ready to enter war games. Okay, you two, you get to join me on a run. Charlie said with a smile. Yay, the two kids flatly cheered. They seemed rather upset at their next exercise. Damn, sarcasm at such a young age. The trainer commented, getting a glare for his language around Naruto and Jason. Come on you two, let's leave Ole Dexter here to mope. You two got running to do. Charlie said before kicking off into what amounted to a very slow jog for him, but was plenty of a fast pace for the boy's short little legs. Jason elbowed Naruto slightly to stop him from snickering at the new probacios receiving the mark from the Legion. Naruto glared at his best friend briefly before turning his eyes back to the older recruits falling back into line. Even now, with 7 bars marking 7 years of service under their own marks, they were 2 years younger than the youngest of the new recruits. Naruto stared at the freshly tattooed mark of one 13-year-old legacy of Bacchus as the chubby boy sniffled lightly. The 10-year-old couldn't stop his own hand from brushing across his mark. The mark of Pluto was a pitchfork-like shape, and the mark had the faintest of changes in texture from his normal skin. Just enough for it to be noticed this was no normal tattoo and had been magically seared into his skin. I don't get why you keep laughing at them. Jason sighed beside him. Because it's funny. Half of them have been so uppity since they saw us. Oh, those little kids can do this, so can I. You cried less than that legacy of Mercury over there did. Naruto said as he pointed with his chin. She's only a year older than we are, and she hasn't been uppity as far as I'm concerned. Jason replied. Yeah, well, we were 3 and well, I guess you're right, she's fine in my book, but that son of Mars over there cried almost as bad as she did. Naruto said, pointing out another provide, this time a 13-year-old. You're being really sour toward them. What's got you in such a good mood? Jason asked, getting Naruto to grin as his cousin caught on. Oh, nothing, just something I overheard the Centurion and Laura talking about. Naruto said with a grin. That caught Jason's attention immediately. Their current Centurion, Joseph Andrews, had previously been their Decanus, essentially their squad leader before succeeding Charlie as their cohort Centurion. Now, Laura Fulton was serving as their unit's Decanus. What was it? Jason asked, hoping beyond hope it was what he and Naruto had been waiting years for. You already know by the way you're asking. Naruto laughed, causing the blonde boy to grin broadly. Finally. We'll show everyone what the 5th is worth. Jason declared. Naruto frowned slightly at that. The issue between the 5th and the other cohorts annoyed him. Then again, it had been part of why he had joined the 5th in the first place. It had once been the most esteemed among the Legion. The 5th carried the Legion to victory time and again throughout history, but sadly that treasured reputation became tarnished over time since settling into New Rome. By now, the 1st and 2nd cohorts were by far the most well-respected, while a series of mistakes and disgraces, most importantly the loss of the Legion's eagle by the 5th's former Centurion in a foolhardy campaign, had resulted in cohort being relegated to the place as worst among the Legion. Naruto? Jason asked, knowing where his friend's mind was headed. We'll show them. Naruto said weakly in agreement. I know you care about the way everyone treats our cohort. Jason said seriously. Of course I do, Jason, but winning a wargame isn't going to change anything. It's not just the way people see our cohort that's the problem either. The whole Legion is a shadow of what it once was. Only the 1st and 3rd cohorts are at full strength, and even they only have singular Centurions now. Naruto ranted before stopping as he noticed the raised eyebrow Jason was sending his way. What? Naruto asked in annoyance. We don't need more Centurions anymore, we do more small-scale battles, so Jason began to point out the reasons for the organizational changes of the Legion over time. For now. Right now the biggest group of monsters we've had to deal with in the last decade was smaller than 30 in number, but how long until it's a real battle? Naruto asked. That's why we do the wargames. That's why this wargame will be our first step to redeem the cohort. Jason said resolutely, causing Naruto to sigh and begin to open his mouth until another voice caught his attention and stopped the discussion between the two young legionaries. Laura, tell me, did you debate the organization of the Legion at 10? One of the other officers of the 5th asked her, causing the girl to snort. I'm pretty sure you were too busy picking your nose at the time, Duncan. She said with a laugh, causing the older boy to snort before waving goodbye to her as he left. Laura looked over at the two boys that snapped to attention at the approach of their section leader. She smiled fondly at them as she stopped before them and inspected them. Both boys were already large for their age and clearly smart for it too, based on the discussions they frequently held with one another. She doubted most of the other legionaries her age talked about such things. At least not as regularly as her two little prodigies did. At only 10 they were already discussing such things. It made her wonder if they would be making actual changes when they reached her age of 16. She looked into 4 bright blue eyes staring back at her. 2 the color of the sky and 2 the color of sapphires. She could see a fire burning there that felt unnatural. Just by looking into their eyes she knew they were bound for great things. The teen didn't think it was because of their parentage. It bolstered it undoubtedly, but there were times that she liked to think that they were fated for something amazing without their demigod natures having anything to do with it. I was going to tell you about what was coming tomorrow, but it sounds like you already have an idea of what I was going to say. She said, grinning down at the kids growing excited before her. So we really are going to be part of the wargames tomorrow? Jason asked. Laura gently tousled the blonde boy's hair. Yep, it will be an open battle between the 4th and 5th. So you will both be in the rear line with me, understood? She asked, getting nods from them. Alright, good, now run a lap for picking fun at your comrades and then off to the barracks to get some rest. She commanded, raising an eyebrow at the small pout from Naruto and the tiny glare Jason shot at his friend. Do I need to repeat myself? She asked, and both boys were sprinting by the time the last word left her mouth. Laura watched them go, smiling at them. She doubted they would be able to show much of the potential she knew they possessed tomorrow, but soon enough they would be making names for themselves and dragging the fifth back to glory all over again. She was a little excited to show them the ropes of a real battle in the morning. "It's not right," Laura growled. "Centurion Andrews, gain control of your subordinate." The praetor snapped, causing Joseph to clamp a strong hand onto the girl's shoulder to reel her back in. While Decanus Fulton spoke out of turn, Joseph said, eyeing the girl to make his point for her to be silent. "She does point out an issue. This match is stacked against my cohort." "Match? Centurion, this is not some little game, we only use the term wargames because we aren't about to actually kill each other. This is nothing less than a simulated battle, meaning that different scenarios will change on a sudden whim at any time. You lead a full cohort, you should be able to handle yourself decently enough." The praetor spoke with a sneer toward the 5th cohort officers. "Full cohort? Our units are barely the size of the old Centurias." Laura quietly growled, though Joseph could hear her well enough from beside her. "With all due respect, sir, you are having my single cohort face against both the 4th and 2nd cohorts in an open field. They not only outnumber us by twice our force, 2/3 of my force are taking part in one of their first wargames." Joseph tried to argue. The 2nd and 4th Centurions didn't speak, but they did send pitying glances toward the leaders of the 5th. They had no real ill will against their comrades, even if they thought themselves better than them. They could see what the praetor was doing. The boy was from the 1st, and he had taken it as a personal slight that the sons of Pluto and Jupiter had joined the 5th instead of his own cohort, so he intended to make their first wargame memorable. He hadn't even attempted to hide the fact either. "Fair has nothing to do with battle, Centurion. Now join your forces, the battle will commence at the sound of the whistle," the praetor declared before turning around to rejoin his fellow praetor and the other officers of the legion that had turned out to watch the skirmish. "For what it's worth, Joe, he's an ass, but I'm going to come at you with everything I got," the Centurion of the 4th Alicross said to her comrade. Same here. Nothing personal," the 2nd cohort Centurion said awkwardly. It wasn't personal, but the 2nd wasn't about to pass up a chance to punch down since they got slapped around by the 1st cohort so often in these wargames. "Yeah. See you out there," Joseph said with a sigh as he led his officers back to their waiting forces. Both Joseph and Laura grimaced as they saw the demoralized faces of their troops. The legionaries had all been in high spirits on their march to the field of Mars since their little mascots would be finally joining them. They wanted to impress the boys and give them a victory for their first battle. Now though twice their numbers stood across from them and one of the 2 cohorts was the 2nd, one regarded only just beneath the prowess of the 1st. The 5th's morale hadn't just fallen. It had died. The looks of defeat already spreading across their faces ate at the handful of leaders they had until they began to slowly mirror their troops. At least until Jason's voice raised loud enough to cause the entire cohort to turn toward the 2 boys who seemed to be arguing. "Shut up," Jason hissed, not wanting to draw attention to themselves. "What? I'm just saying they are so scared that they have to double up to go against us. I mean, that's cool. Even if we lose, all we gotta do is beat them up a little bit and we kinda win," Naruto said with a shrug. "What do you mean?" Jason asked, not getting what he meant by winning even if they lose. "Well, I mean if they can only win because they have twice as many guys as us, doesn't that mean we sort of win? Especially if we mess them up in the fight?" Naruto asked a bit too innocently. Laura caught on to what the devious kids were up to immediately. She'd worked too closely with them for her not to, and Joseph wasn't far behind. He'd have to thank the pair later for setting him up for a rousing speech. "Listen up," he roared, causing the entire cohort to flinch before snapping into attention once more. "You all call yourselves Romans," he snarled as he stormed up and down the line of legionaries, looking increasingly more furious and thereby intimidating. Joseph wasn't small after all. The cohort shifted before him ever so slightly, causing him to stop suddenly and face them directly. "Stand still and at attention when I address you. 2 of our own see the reality of our situation when the rest of you just see the futility. The rest of the legion looks down on you and sets you up for failure, and what do? You cower beneath such treatment. Legionary Uzumaki front and center, now. Grace, you too." The other legionaries stepped aside as Naruto and Jason raced to the front. Both boys were dressed in slightly oversized sets of equipment, but their weapons, being magically enchanted by the gods, were perfectly sized for their bodies. "What do you 2 see out there?" Joseph asked. Soldiers?" Naruto asked. "Jason?" Joe asked. "The 2nd and 4th cohorts?" he asked. You both might need glasses. Anyone want to tell me what is actually over there?" the Centurion asked his troops. The cohort remained silent as they glanced between one another. Joseph pivoted and pointed over at the opposing force. "The only thing I see are losers." "You heard me. Losers," The Praetors really must have a secret love for the 5th because they doubled up the number of losers we get to slap around today. He cheered, getting a few snorts and chuckles from his own troops. So, Jason, what do you see up there? Joseph asked again. Losers? Jason shouted back. And Naruto? Joseph asked. Losers, sir. Naruto called back. What about the rest of you? You see anybody worthwhile up there? Joseph asked, causing the 5th to break into a string of jeers and shouts, mocking their opponents. That's more like it. Now form up. Naruto, Jason, you two stick with Laura, you get some kill points, or I'm going to take over your training personally again. The Centurion called, getting both boys to race into their positions with the force. As the 5th formed up into a tight square, Joseph began leading his legionaries into a grunting chant as they began to advance toward the opposing force ahead of them. Naruto and Jason did just as they had been instructed and formed up with Laura as they advanced across the field. The 2nd had quickly formed up as well and begun to advance as well, though they held a looser formation allowing them to move faster. The 4th, though, was still trying to properly situate itself to advance, as the 5th had caught them a bit off guard by their sudden advance. They evidently expected the singular cohort to try and set up a defensive position. Soon the 2nd had left their comrades in the 4th in the dust as they quickly crossed the open field toward their prey. Halfway there they formed their own shield wall without breaking stride and barreled toward the 5th. Brace. Joseph screamed and the 5th halted instantly, bracing for the sudden impact of the 2nd cohort. A loud crash echoed across the field as shields met shields, and both sides began struggling for dominance. Grunts and cries from the front of the formations intermixed with sounds of the shields and blessed practice weapons. Advance. Joseph snarled, and the 5th obeyed, as best as they could. The two groups of legionaries struggled against one another until the 2nd finally made a mistake. In an attempt to break the 5th's line, their Centurion and a small group of their more experienced troops folded around the 5th's flank to try and collapse it inward. Instead they found Laura's line including Naruto and Jason waiting for them. The two boys did just as their Centurion had ordered and scored kill points against the opposing cohort. The practice weapons knocked anyone struck with a blow that would have killed them normally out of the battle. Naruto even came face to face with the 2nd cohort Centurion. By now the lines on both cohorts was beginning to falter as casualties mounted. Naruto and his opponent found themselves in a one-on-one fight while the rest of their teams battled around them. While he had been more prepared to face Naruto than those that had fallen to the boy already, the Centurion still underestimated him. The son of Pluto was happy to take advantage of that fact. Smashing his shield down onto the foot of the older boy, causing him to shift out of his guard at the sudden pain, Naruto managed a glancing blow against his inner thigh in what would have been a slice and a deep one in a real fight. Feeling his leg go completely numb as the magic of the Wargam decided it was too damaged to use, the Centurion fell backwards, allowing Naruto to step forward and drive his weapon down against the fallen commander's breastplate, finishing him. Seeing their Centurion fall to a 10-year-old, the 2nd began to back and retreat, only to completely collapse as Joseph led a charge into their ranks, scattering the remnants of the 2nd and sending them fleeing. Rather than pursue them though, Joe rallied the remnants of the 5th as the 4th cohort finally arrived to join the fight. It wasn't looking good for the 5th now though. While breaking the 2nd and sending them running was a hell of a feat, the 4th was fresh and ready for battle, while more than a third of the 5th was already killed and all of them were tired. Still they reformed into a defensive position and did their best to hold off the enemy advance. Gradually, line by line, the 5th was whittled down. The 4th suffered heinous casualties to do it, but they removed the 5th cohort's legionaries one by one. Eventually even Joe fell and Laura went after him. The battle continued though as not a single 5th cohort member attempted to break and run, even after their Centurion fell. At their center Naruto and Jason fought on and on, already making a clear impression with their first Wargam. They too fell, though, as they were overrun in a final skirmish that saw them back to back against nearly 34th cohort legionaries. The Praetors, clearly displeased by the actual end results, were at least pleased that the 5th had been defeated. In the end less than 40 legionaries remained between the 2nd and 4th, while the 5th had lost their full force. While the 2nd and 4th received half-hearted praise from those that had witnessed the fight, the 5th celebrated back at their barracks. Naruto and Jason both quickly became considered cohort's darlings, even if they already had such a position pretty much in the bag already due to their age. Naruto himself was made MVP for the 5th when they announced he had killed the 2nd cohort Centurion. The 4th had been gracious enough to recognize the 5th had more or less won through defeat, and the 3rd had also shown their support. Several among the 1st cohort had made it clear that they now considered the 2nd lower than scum, and the 2nd had taken their defeat at the hands of the 5th extremely hard, ousting their former Centurion in favor of a new one and nearly breaking themselves in training. Sadly for them, the rest of the Legion had taken the upset as a sign to train harder as well. None more than the fifth, which was quickly working its way back into the minds of the people of New Rome as they soaked up any stories they could get about Naruto and Jason. Well, more Jason. New Rome would always have a preference toward a son of Jupiter. In the last year, the fifth had begun to claw its way into the hearts of the people of Rome. Naruto and Jason both served as decani. The boys were the youngest to hold the rank, though technically Jason held the record, being he was a few months younger than Naruto was. Their sections were extremely competitive with one another, something both boys did on purpose, as they both believed competition and obstacles to overcome made their legionaries stronger. A friendly rivalry had steadily developed between them that helped drive the fifth cohort on to victory more often than not now. The day wasn't a day for wargames though. Instead, they were being taken to be presented before the praetors for some reason. At least that asshole isn't running things anymore. Naruto grumbled, only to get a swat on the back of the head from Laura and a narrow-eyed look from Joe. Mind your manners, I won't have one of my legionaries, especially a decana, speaking like that in front of the praetors. Joe commanded. Yes, sir. Naruto replied, properly admonished. That being said, the newest praetors aren't so bad. Still give us the worst work details, but they don't treat us like trash. Laura pointed out. That doesn't mean they treat us right. The whole legion needs work. Naruto growled quietly. Jason begrudgingly nodded from beside his friend. You might be right, but you will only speak when asked to in this meeting, and even then you will only speak in respect. Yes, sir. Both boys replied quickly. Good, now come on. Joe instructed as he stepped into the praetor's office and stood at attention, snapping off a smart salute to the praetor. Laura, Naruto, and Jason each followed his lead. Standing before them weren't just the praetors. Alongside them, the augur, as well as a boy from the fourth cohort and a girl from the third with their respective centurions standing beside them, filled the room. At ease. Now that we are all present, we can get started. The male praetor said as he rolled out a map on his desk. That is a map of Salt Lake City, in Utah. Before the Second World War we had a pretty large outpost there, but over time we staffed it with less and less legionaries until the failed campaign to Alaska hit us with a manpower crisis. Since then it's been abandoned and sealed up. The female praetor explained. There should be some weapons inside, as well as a set of records within that should have been brought back when the last legionaries left. The only problem is that the last legionaries there never left. Monsters noticed the outpost was undermanned and attacked. There were only 2 survivors. Both of whom later died from their injuries shortly after arriving here to tell us what happened. The male said before running a hand through his hair. That's been almost 20 years ago now. He continued on. We have no real idea what to expect there, but Salt Lake City is pretty deep into the orange zone. The residents of the room flicked their eyes over to the atlas on the wall. On it the world was divided into 7 colored zones. The safest was the city of New Rome. It sat behind magic and divine barriers and had the legion waiting just outside it to defend it. It was the purple zone. The area surrounding it, including the farms that fed the small city and Camp Jupiter, were the blue zone. The safe zones. Outside of the hidden territory that compassed the home of the legion was the green zone. Regularly patrolled by the legion to keep it primarily clear of monsters, the green zone encompassed San Francisco and just a small sliver inland. Beyond the 3 primary zones things fell away from New Rome's control. California itself was regarded as the yellow zone. Occasional operations to clear out larger groups of monsters or more dangerous monsters kept the state relatively safe, though the danger remained. The zone being brought up was the orange zone. Pretty much everything in North America that was south of Vancouver, north of Mexico City, and west of the Rockies fell into this zone. This area wasn't safe, the Legion could project power there if it needed to, but it was not considered controlled at all. The last zone in North America was the red zone. The rest of the continent, from the reaches of Alaska and Mexico to the east coast of America, was considered wilderness by the Legion. It only bothered with those areas during a quest or major campaign, neither of which had occurred since the loss of the Legion's eagle. Everything else in the world was the black zone, or simply the dead zone. It was forbidden for Romans to go there. Though by now the people had forgotten if that had been a mandate sent down from Olympus or simply their own regulation to try to keep their people safe. So we are going on a quest then? Laura asked. No. A quest would indicate the gods or a prophecy. You are going on an operation. The augur is simply here to see if there is any kind of fair omen for the mission. The female praetor explained. Laura, you are the most senior here. You'll be in command and you 4 will follow her lead. Understood. The male cut back in. Yes sir, but why 5? Laura answered, before turning with the praetors toward the augur. You will suffer on this mission, however 5 in honor of your cohort will grant you some blessing, and with the sons of Pluto and Jupiter among your number victory is assured. The augur stated with a pitying glance sent their way. Well, there you have it. You'll meet at the gates in the morning. We managed to secure a car for you, and I know you have a license, Laura. The praetors said. The subordinates weren't pleased. It was clear that the praetors and augur had more information regarding the quest than they wished to share, something that no doubt had to do with the suffering on the mission, part of what the augur had stated. Still, there was nothing much they could do about it. It was an order from the praetors directly, and they had no truly viable reasons to refuse, despite the worry they held for the upcoming trial. After being dismissed, the different team members each accompanied their centurion back to their barracks to pack and get ready for the mission, and hopefully get a good night's rest. They doubted that though. Naruto and Jason were the only ones that seemed to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as the 5 legionaries met at the gates. The small team took the opportunity to properly introduce themselves before they left, and both praetors were there to see them off. Naruto and Jason were already pretty well known by the whole legion. They'd been serving for 8 years and were still younger than most new recruits. On top of that, the 2 boys were a nightmare on the field of Mars or in the arena. Plenty of the other cohort soldiers had been humbled by the tiny terrors. Laura was decently known as well. Most considered her to be the next in line for centurion of the 5th cohort, and she was a solid leader and an even better soldier. Like the 2 boys, she was a direct child of one of the gods. Unlike them though, she wasn't the child of one of the Olympians, instead she was a daughter of Clementia, the goddess of forgiveness and mercy. Something that both Naruto and Jason had found ironic at times, as Laura was very rigid and unforgiving at times. "My name is David Kind, I'm a legacy of Bacchus. 4th cohort." The now named David introduced. He was a lanky boy with dark hair and eyes, a few years younger than Laura, but he would be bigger than her soon. "Teresa Rodriguez. Legacy of Vulcan." Teresa said. She was a brawny girl that was younger than Laura, but bigger than her too. She was also covered in all manner of tiny scars from working on projects in Camp Jupiter. "Well, you all know the basics in your mission. There is a garage on the far side of the tunnel, your ride is there. I recommend getting to know one another on the trip. Once you are in the orange zone, you 5 will have to really rely on one another according to the augury." The praetor said, getting the 5 younger legionaries to nod. "Return victorious or don't," the other praetor said coldly before snapping a surprising salute at them. The group returned it before stepping out of the gates. Laura led the way. She was just trying to focus on what she was going to get to drive at the moment to try and distract herself from worrying about Naruto and Jason. The 2 boys were almost in a completely opposite mindset. They weren't worried at all. Arrogance or naivety, they were convinced this wasn't going to be a problem. Sadly, the current augur of New Rome wasn't one to lie, and suffering lied ahead of them on their journey. In the 3 months since the return of the Salt Lake City Armory to New Rome's hands, the members of the quest had gained a rather decent amount of favor with both New Rome and the rest of the Legion, as the first to embark and return on a successful quest in years. Naruto and Jason easily reaped the greatest amount of respect and honor from the event, almost as if they were the ones who had led the quest. Both were quite humble about it, but the amount of attention they received did fill their egos to a degree. Sadly, soon enough the truth about their quest became clear. The weapons of the Salt Lake Armory were cursed. An insidious curse that could have possibly been set by Legion on its own equipment so that it might not be stolen. If that was the case, it was currently biting them in the ass. Already the other members of the quest outside of Naruto and Jason had fallen victim to it. They gradually became mute and listless. The light in their eyes seemed to wither down to a flickering candlelight, and they barely ate unless directly commanded to do so. At times they briefly came out of their near catatonic state only for a few moments. Other times they flew into a mad rage and tried their best to attack others. When suffering was predicted, I would have preferred monsters or something we could actually do something against. Naruto growled as he skipped a stone across the little Tiber. "I'm with you on that. Seeing Laura like that, why are we not affected?" Jason agreed and began to wonder about his and Naruto's apparent immunity. "Seems obvious enough. Same reason we always get special treatment, we're children of the big 3. If that wasn't enough, maybe being blessed by 2 more Olympians makes us even more invulnerable to this curse or whatever," Naruto replied with a shrug. The pair fell into silence thinking about Laura, David, and Teresa. The 3 of them had grown close to the 2 boys, but Laura was practically their elder sister, having been their commander for so long. They both felt immense guilt at the fact they were unaffected by the curse, while the others seemed a step away from death. The healers say that they're losing too much weight. They want to put them under constant watch so they can be ordered to eat when necessary, Jason commented. Naruto didn't say anything. What was there to say to that? It was a terrible thing and he only felt more useless at that information. "Maybe we can get the job," Jason suggested. Naruto perked up at that. It might be nothing more than telling their comrades when to eat and keeping an eye on them, but it would be better than nothing. Although deep down he did worry about being around Laura and seeing her like that. It just felt wrong. "Let's go annoy someone until we get the post then," Naruto said, only to stop when he saw several legionaries and one of the praetors rushing toward the infirmary. "What's going on?" Jason wondered aloud. How would I know? Naruto bit back before waving for his cousin to follow him while he rushed after the praetor and his entourage. Jason bit back a retort at Naruto's attitude and followed after him. They both had moments of being tested ever since the others had fallen ill. The pair of them struggled to catch up to the much older soldiers ahead of them. Sons of the King of Heaven and King of the Underworld they might be, but they were still young and had the unbearably short legs that came with that. They did catch up though and stopped nearby to hear just what was going on. It was good that they did. It seemed the curse was worse than what they first realized. "Doc, what the hell do you mean it's spreading?" The praetor snarled loud enough that even Naruto and Jason around the corner could easily understand him. "With all due respect to you praetor, what do you think I mean? Look at him. Carl Dramillo, a first cohort legionary, has the same symptoms as Laura and the others." The medic said as he pulled back the curtain to reveal an older dark-haired boy. Neither Naruto or Jason knew the members of the other cohorts that well, but they vaguely recognized him as one of the older members and one of the soldiers the first cohort centurion relied on the most. As the doctor had said, he seemed to suffer from the same affliction that had taken Laura, David, and Teresa's faculties from them. "Oh shit." The praetor groaned. "Yeah, we have a real problem now. If this is spreading, we need to lock down quickly before everyone ends up like this." The medic said, waving his hand in front of Carl's face and getting absolutely no response from the boy. "We need to figure out the exact parameters of this curse. I want any children or legacy of trivia, we have to figure this out. I don't care if they have to come from New Rome instead of the Legion, I want a solution," the praetor said as he turned to leave. "Sir, what about?" the doctor began. "Mickey, do whatever needs to be done. If you have to seal everyone up in their barracks to stop this, then do it. And find Naruto and Jason, they seemed immune when we thought the curse was from taking the gold from Salt Lake, but if it's something else they might know or they could be at risk as well." But that the praetor stormed out of the infirmary intent on informing his partner on the situation and calling the Senate and Centurions to discuss their approach. The medic sighed before he saw the pair of blonde heads peeking around the corner and sighed. "Jason, Naruto. Come here, boys." The two young boys slowly edged out of their poor hiding spot and presented themselves to the medic. "You heard everything?" he asked, getting slow nods from both of them. "Well, that saves me having to track you down. I'm afraid we are going to have to quarantine you until the children of trivia can tell us how this curse passes on to others. I'm sorry, boys. Come this way." The older teen began leading them. Naruto and Jason exchanged a brief glance before slowly following after one of the few older members of the Legion who had actively served longer than them. With both boys already at 8 years in the Legion, only the most senior boys and girls had more bars of service branded onto their arm. Mickey, or rather Aaron McKay, had a total of 15 bars on his arm and was a young addition, just not as young as the boys. He had joined when he was 7 and had been looking for an opportunity to hopefully end his career. Sadly, as the direct child of Apollo and a first-generation legacy of Asclepius, Mickey was too good to let go, and he couldn't stop himself from sticking around to care for the legionaries that were more seriously injured or sick. "Can we be quarantined with Laura and the others?" Naruto asked. Mickey shot the boy a look before smiling sadly. "Sorry bud, no can do. I can keep you and Jason together, but that's the best I can do." The blonde deflated, but his cousin took the next question for him. "What about Laura and the others? Someone has to stay with them and keep them healthy, right?" Jason asked. "We'll take care of it, boys. I'll do my best to keep an eye on them personally and assign a couple of my siblings to watch over them when I'm busy, okay?" Mickey asked, getting nods from the boys as he stopped at their new bedroom door. "Okay, you two, this is you. I'm sure the praetors will be here after a little while to question you about the quest again. So sit tight." Mickey ushered them in before closing the door up behind them and audibly locking it from the outside. The two blondes scanned their new prison cell. A couple of basic bunks, like were typically found in the cohort barracks, along with the most basic of amenities. A little bathroom complete with shower and a small desk. Neither were very pleased, but they weren't fools either. They had at least an idea of how bad the situation was in regard to the spreading curse. Mickey and the two newly quarantined boys seemed to have a very different meaning for the phrase "a little while." The praetors didn't come to question the two of them till the sun was almost setting. Hours spent locked in what amounted to a bare-bones bedroom was playing hell with the attention span of two young demigod boys by that point. The fact that they could answer the questions given to them at all was impressive, but sadly, it didn't mean that their time in confinement came to an end. Instead, Mickey delivered several books about New Rome's laws, history, and other textbook-style items to read. As if things couldn't get any worse. The two of them turned it into a game like most things they disliked doing, such as chores around the barracks. Soon they were quizzing one another on obscure New Roman laws. Loser had half as many push-ups and sit-ups to do. Both were physically geared kids, so it didn't matter much, but it was something to keep them occupied. That and harassing the various children and legacies of Apollo whenever they brought food to them. Not just to make them have a hard time, of course, both Naruto and Jason were far too serious for that. No, they were more focused on finding out the situation with the Legion and Laura and their other comrades from the quest. Sadly, they got nothing from the healers. That is, except one detail. The curse had spread again. More Ethan to a single other person this time. 12 more, not including Laura, David, Teresa, and Carl. That was almost overnight. By the second day, the total number of cases had slowed considerably, but still it had climbed to 15 plus the original 4. A breakthrough finally came through on the third day. By now the total number of cases was 23. They knew why some caught it and some didn't. Unsurprisingly, the curse was overall relatively weak in strength, and with the blood of Jupiter and Pluto, as well as the blessing of Ceres and Juno, they seemed to simply overwhelm its magic naturally. Others that were immune to it had turned out to be direct children of Apollo and Trivia. That being said, the curse didn't spread like a real disease. Rather, it passed to those that had kept the Imperial gold taken from the Salt Lake outpost. The gold itself was tainted as suspected, but the initial cleansing performed by the children of Trivia had only managed to dampen the effect from cursing the whole legion. Any who had taken the items for themselves felt its full effects in short order. With this knowledge, Naruto and Jason were released from quarantine. They were even allowed to visit Laura and the others. The boys both regretted doing so when they did. The others each looked like some sort of husk of the former legionary they had been. They were dying. Slowly and painfully, as the children of Trivia had soon found that their comrades were still present, effectively trapped within their own bodies, and only able to be brought back to the surface of their minds temporarily. The cursed weapons and other items had been sealed up until something could be figured out for it. Everyone seemed on edge, fearing that something else had been missed and that they would all soon end up simply withering away. New Rome caught wind of what was going on, and soon near riots had broken out. The populace was enraged and demanding a part in the government so that such important and deadly situations weren't kept from them. Fistfights between civilians and legionaries when they tried to storm the Senate building and demand a report of the situation had been the last straw, and some had found themselves in jail, while the praetors and Senate argued over what to do. Naruto felt utterly useless and had all but locked himself inside his father's temple and prayed non-stop to the king of the underworld for some sort of help. A week after being released from quarantine, Naruto got an answer. One that was loud and clear for the entire legion. The cursed items seemed to melt through the floor of the room they had been locked in, and in a dark flash, replicas made of Stygian iron replaced the Imperial gold. An entire armory's worth of the dark black metal was unheard of in the living world, and now the legion had one of its very own. Furthermore, new uniforms and armor appeared fitted precisely and even named for the afflicted legionaries. These uniforms, though, were blackened and possessed the mark of Pluto on the side plates of every helmet, clearly marking them as a gift from Lord Pluto. For Naruto himself, he felt his father reach into his dreams directly for the first time in his life. It was short and rather forceful in comparison to the dreams he had heard some other legionaries mention their sire sending with them in the past. Where they often received fanciful dreams with a lot of possible meanings, Naruto's were incredibly straightforward. He saw himself leading a force of black-clad legionaries, among them Laura, Teresa, and David, all looking even more deathly and husk-like than before. They marched on old Roman outposts and forts across the United States west of the Mississippi and slew monsters in the dozens. One by one they reclaimed the items in these places and sent them back to New Rome, but they never returned. Instead, they fought on even as they fell, one after another, either from the attack of a monster or the curse that already held sway over them. Each time one died, though, Naruto grasped their arm as a cromade, and suddenly he was holding onto their spirit. He then led them to the shadows and walked through with them before depositing them at the steps of his father's own palace in the underworld. As he awoke, he heard a simple order from a deep rumbling voice that seemed to hold the slightest bit of warmth for him. Command them, lead them, guide them. That was all. He then awoke and found he had been sleeping within his father's temple, having fallen asleep while praying to him for help. It was bittersweet, having the knowledge and support his father wanted to give him. There was no way to really save his comrades. The curse was irreversible. It was designed as such, but that didn't mean there was nothing he could do for them at all. He could give them a death they could be proud of, and when the end came, he could personally escort them to his father's own halls. He needed to speak with the praetors. With the miracles that Pluto had already performed within Camp Jupiter over the night, it wasn't hard to convince not only the praetors, but all of the Senate as well, that what Naruto had seen was clearly a message from the gods. Or more precisely, from Pluto. Still, they weren't exactly fond of the idea of sending Naruto out with only the cursed legionaries. At least until Pluto made his will very clear by sending none other than Proserpina, his wife, to make it clear. And make it clear she did. With her husband and mother getting along in regards to something for the first time since she had been taken as Pluto's wife, she had a very special place in her heart for the boy that made that possible. Naruto had her backing, and that meant suddenly that he had the backing of at least 3 major deities that the new Romans were less than interested in insulting by disregarding their wishes. Therefore no one was bold enough to argue with the queen of the underworld. So it was that Naruto, only 11 years old, was placed in command of 23 other legionaries, all clearly marked as his father's from then on, and marched to the hidden entrance to their little valley. Mourners said goodbye to their beloved family, even if the soldiers they cried for stood stoically and empty. Naruto and Jason saw each other off, though both refused to even utter the word goodbye. That was it. A rapid refitting of the cursed legionaries and shipping them out as quickly as possible to hopefully quell the disgruntlement in New Rome. Although, with new protests mounting in size by the day over the imprisonment of several new Roman citizens after the recent riots, that seemed a slim chance. Especially as they had yet to even be told that several teens led by an 11-year-old had just embarked on a literal suicide mission. Naruto soon found that his time spent with the marked legionaries blended together. Between raids on old outposts and forts anywhere between days and weeks could pass. At times he even felt like he had somehow received a curse as well as he fell into a pattern and his mind simply ran on autopilot. They had done just as his father had desired. Steadily and meticulously they made their way to each of the abandoned constructs of the Legion. They culled any monsters they came across and sent weapons, armor, and other artifacts back home in mass quantities. Naruto was stunned by the effectiveness of his comrades. They could barely even feed themselves, but in battle they were menacing. Stoic and silent they did exactly as ordered to the letter, and Naruto had found that by giving relatively broad orders to them, they performed even better in a fight. It was proof that the legionaries inside were still there. They recalled their training and experiences, but had none of the natural hesitance of a normal living person any longer. That made them incredibly effective at what they were doing, but not perfect. One by one the legionaries lost their lives. Naruto was heartbroken when the first occurred, not because they were killed, but because it was Laura and she wasn't killed by a monster. Rather, while the group was sleeping, her physical body finally gave out. It took a moment, but soon Naruto recalled what he needed to do. He clasped onto Laura's arm and held tightly as if he was about to lift her to her feet. Instead he gasped when her body suddenly moved and her hand grasped a hold of his forearm just as he had with her. Just like the vision he stood and her corpse's hand fell away as the shimmering form of Laura was pulled free of her mortal form. Unlike her body she was as Naruto recalled. Strong and healthy, smiling too as she greeted him with a warm grin. He led her along after him as he stepped into shadow, his first time truly traveling in such a method, and found himself at the almost literal doorstep to his father's palace in the underworld. Lord Pluto was not there to greet them. Instead a collection of spirits. Long-dead legionaries and even a small collection of Laura's own ancestors were present. They welcomed her kindly and even cheerfully. Saying goodbye was easier than Naruto had expected as well. He came to the conclusion that perhaps either death affected him less due to his parentage, or more than likely he had been waiting for this moment since Laura had taken Isle and was happy she was free of her mortal prison. Another step through the shadows and he found himself returning to his unit. With their next mission, they returned Laura's body as well as 2 more legionaries that had fallen since she had. Gradually they were worn down in numbers until only Naruto and 2 others remained. Some of his unit had found their peace by sacrificing themselves for him, as he was the only living member of the force. The same would occur with the last 2. A boy from the 4th cohort and a girl from the 2nd. Both had leapt in front of him to receive the deadly poisoned arrows, loosed by a pair of particularly hostile centaurs. The poison acted quickly, though not quickly enough for the pair of horse hybrids. And with their death Naruto recovered a small outpost in New Mexico. Little of value was present, but several old records dating as far back as before the outpost was constructed in 1840. After delivering his comrades to his father's realm, for the first time in over half a year, Naruto turned to make his way home. Sadly as the saying goes, there is no rest for the wicked, and Naruto found himself dreaming vividly once more, too clearly to be anything else other than a message from his father. The dream was less blunt and visual focused compared to the last. Instead Naruto found himself facing shadows in the rough image of a man. It had no discernible features, though the shadows looked slightly darker, approximate where a mouth and eyes would have been on a human being. Instinctively Naruto felt a cool though caring feeling weigh on him as the shadow turned its eyes toward him. A tiniest segment of his father's power made itself known, and Naruto felt as if he had been praised without a single word being spoken. That didn't stop Pluto from further expressing his pride and the well wishes of Naruto's fallen brothers and sisters. You have done perfectly in your task with regards to the cursed legionaries. However, the work of a member of the Legion only stops in death, and unlike your comrades, you are still very much alive, my son, and you will be for a long time to come, I believe. Pluto's voice was soft, not as deep as the one that had spoken in Naruto's last dream, but far more friendly than that had been. "Thank you, father," Naruto said with a small grin though he eyed the shadows thoughtfully. "I'm sorry for sounding cynical, but I highly doubt you contacted me like this just to give me a pat on the back or to say Merry Christmas." Pluto hummed before a soft chuckle fell from the lips of its mouth. "No, you're correct. I haven't come just for that, son. Though I feel a need to comment that your personality reminds me very much of your mother's. In fact, outside of looks you are much more like her than myself." Naruto tensed at that bit of unexpected information. He even felt awkward at the comparison of his mother, being as he had no recollection of her and could not go and meet her in the underworld as his duty only allowed him brief visits to deliver his fallen comrades. "Forgive me, I shouldn't have said that so out of the blue. Besides, we have much to discuss and the longer we are here discussing it, the more likely that it is that my brothers will notice something," Pluto said as his shadows drew in closely to Naruto. "Even here, like in my dreams?" Naruto asked. "There is no place that is completely free of the influence of the gods, my son. We have our fingers in every facet of life and death, even if it is only by the tiniest bit. Yes, even dreams are not completely free of the intrusion or notice of myself and the other gods," he explained. Naruto simply nodded and kept silent to await his father's explanation for his contact. "You are very special to me, my boy. I struggle to show that perhaps, but you are the first child I have had in the better part of a century and you are already far more gifted than most of those that I have spawned. I need you to know these things so that you know that I do not place this burden upon you lightly," Pluto went on to say. But those words Naruto began to grow nervous. Never was Pluto described as all that emotional of a figure, and even when Naruto had felt the comforting sensation in his time dreaming of his father or whenever he stepped into his father's temple, but this was different. So openly praised and adored, it made his cheeks darken ever so slightly, and he couldn't help himself but to look away and cough to clear his throat to fight back the tickle that had suddenly appeared within. "I'm not trying to simply praise you. I'm telling you this because I shouldn't be telling you about what I am going to tell you. Something that you cannot repeat once you leave here. At least not for a great amount of time," the god of the dead continued. "What do you know of the Greeks?" Pluto asked, getting a surprised look from his son at the question. "I suppose what anyone from back home knows. They were our predecessors and our enemies, right?" Naruto asked. "So much more than that, Naruto. But you will learn more of that in time. Right now I must tell you of the Greeks today," Pluto explained. "Like, Europe, Greece?" Naruto asked, a little bit confused. "No. I mean the children of the Greek version of the Olympian gods," Pluto said. Naruto was confused, but only briefly before his eyes began to widen. The red zone. The eastern United States. Just like Greece was east of Rome, so too were the new Romans west of the new Greeks. "The Grecies still live on," Naruto murmured quietly. "Yes, and that is why you cannot say anything about what else I am going to tell you. Only that you were sent on a quest by me personally at the end of your last task," Pluto explained. "I don't understand all that well, father, but I promise to keep my trap shut," Naruto replied. "Even from that sky-spawned cousin of yours?" Pluto said with sharp authority coming into his tone. "Even from Jason?" Naruto nodded. "Even from Sears?" Pluto said, getting a wide-eyed look from his son in return. The feeling rather than actual sight of a harsh glance from the shadows caused Naruto to nod once again. "Even from grandmother?" Naruto replied. The shadow seems to roll its eyes at the term he used for Sears, but ignored it for the large part. "Good, then I can begin explaining things a bit more about some issues that have suddenly risen over the last few days, including the theft of the Helm of Darkness," Pluto said, getting a gasp from Naruto though his father didn't stop speaking. "As well as the need to check on your siblings," Pluto said, getting the expected stammer from Pluto at that revelation. Sears rarely came to the underworld, though Pluto had begrudgingly made it available for her to summon at any time that she desired. He wouldn't refuse Proserpina and her mother from seeing one another for half the year truly. Today though she was not here to visit her beloved daughter. Instead she was here to visit Pluto himself. After all, they had a lot to discuss when she felt how long he had visited with Naruto in his dreams. With Jupiter, or rather Zeus, having just had his symbol of power stolen in the last few days and blaming Neptune, or again, rather Poseidon, things had become incredibly chaotic in Olympus. That Pluto remained both emotionally and physically distant from that chaos had Sears more worried than if he had plunged himself into the argument. If only just to take advantage of the situation to snipe insults and rude comments at his two younger brothers. "Sears?" the dark man asked as he realized she had come into his domain. "Pluto," she said serenely though it had the same type of energy as a coiled snake ready to bite. "Well, you haven't started throwing out threats and cursing my name yet, so I'm guessing this isn't about my wife. So what do you want?" he asked bluntly. Sears but back her retorted his words. She didn't come here to fight. He just made it too easy to want to fight with him. Especially with his word choice in calling her daughter his wife so proudly. Curiosity is what brings me here, brother. Curiosity over why exactly it was you spent so long talking to Naruto in his dreams recently, and now, rather than returning to New Rome and Camp Jupiter, he is instead heading east into the Legion's red zone. Sears said hotly. Pluto was silent before sighing loudly and crossing his arms over his chest. Mind your own business, Sears. He is my son. Not yours. Pluto answered stiffly. Now you listen here, Sears began. No. You listen, little sister. You are in my domain and making demands of me. Get out before I threw you out. The King of the Dead commanded with a smooth but deep tone. Sears' eyes blazed in fury, but the goddess had to acknowledge that she had no real power here in the land of the dead. Perhaps I should go and speak to our siblings and nieces and nephews. She threatened. Unfortunately, Pluto called her bluff. You would condemn Naruto to death, sister. If you did so, it would be very unpleasant for the many children you have on both coasts. Now leave. Sears glared, but she did as she was told and flashed out of the domain of her eldest sibling. Pluto simply pinched the bridge of his nose in annoyance before turning back to the work he had been focused on. The thought did well on his son as he performed the task assigned to him. He hoped things went smoothly, but he was confident his son could be flexible if need be. So this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video, guys. Let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Bye bye.